Welcome back to IndyFest, everybody. I am thrilled to have the panel that we've assembled here to talk about the voting challenges and changes that are coming in Nevada. And I'm even more thrilled to have one of the best young reporters I've ever met, Tabitha Mueller, who is helping me. And I hope that she's going to be sitting there 10 years from now, and then I will no longer call her young, but I want her to be here. Let me just introduce the panelists real quickly. We have the Secretary of State, Cisco Aguilar, is here. You can applaud for, you better applaud for each of them if you're going to applaud for her. Him, Sondra Cosgrove, who official title is the Executive Director for Vote Nevada, but I see her as the Nevada do-gooder on all things, and it's a frustrating profession, but she does it well. So give her a round of applause. And last but not least, on the far left, are you on the far left, sir? Athar Haseebullah, how did I do?
Good.
He's the Executive Director at ACLU of Nevada. Give him a round of applause as well. So we're going to try to cover a lot of ground, Tabitha and I here, and a lot of different things, voter challenges and changes. And we're going to talk about question 3. I want to talk about voter ID, but I also want to talk about, I think, something that's on a lot of people's minds, and that's why I'm going to start with the Secretary of State. Election security, how are things going to go? What keeps you up at night, sir?
Let me just start with, Nevada runs some of the most safest, secure, and accessible elections in the country, and we should be proud as a state. We've been working for 18 months to prepare for this election. We have 17 clerks in our 17 counties who do an amazing job of running and orchestrating this election, making sure we Nevadans have the fundamental right to exercise that constitutional right. We know Nevada is a battleground state. We are the purple state. We are the swing state. We matter state. And so understanding that responsibility and that duty, they take it very seriously. These are individuals who live in those local communities. They know their neighbors, they know what they need, and they're doing what they need to do to ensure we have a voice. So this didn't just start a few months ago. This has been working since I've been elected and started on January 3rd.
Real quickly, and then I'm going to let Tabitha jump in. Playing devil's advocate here a little bit, there are some people who say, oh my God, the Secretary of State, he's a rookie. He's never done this before. You had a great reputation before you became Secretary of State, but this is kind of new to you. Maybe you're learning on the job. And you have new registrars in the 2 biggest counties, lots of turnover. Shouldn't we be worried about all this?
First of all, I have a great staff, and when I spent time at Agassiz, we always went out on a project. We said, who are the smartest people in the room that can help us get through what we need to get through? And I feel like I have that with the Secretary of State's staff. Mark Velashin, who's the Deputy Secretary of State, has been through this process. He understands the responsibility. He served in the Marines for 20 years. He understands how to lead a team during a very difficult time. And his leadership is critical to all of this. You mentioned 11 of our 17 clerks are new to the position. 3 of those 11 have cycled out probably over the last 6 months. But in Clark County, Lorena is new to the registrar position, but she's been in the election space for 19 years. Her muscle is so strong with elections that I'm completely confident with what she's doing. In Washoe County, where another 15% of our voters are, we have 2 amazing deputies there, Andrew and Addie, and speaking with them, and Andrew's experience in San Diego County, which is an extremely large county, he brings that skill set to Washoe County and to the 400,000 voters there. So those 2 counties are in good hands. They will do what they need to do. Also, too, prior to this election, I feel like elections offices were kind of these islands within county government. That's not the case anymore. County managers are now deeply engaged in the process to ensure that the registrars and the clerks have the resources they need to serve their community's voters.
And actually, I wanted to follow up on something because we've seen that there are some errors, right? Documentation errors and some other issues, voter registration stuff. Is the Secretary of State's office really ready? And how would you sort of respond to criticism that some of those issues that we saw maybe earlier in the cycle may be contributing to voter distrust in our election system?
I understand those concerns. I understand those issues. But before you're able to run a strong organization, a strong operation, you need to ensure that infrastructure is there to be able to do it. When we took over, we had 17 counties running 17 different systems with 17 different processes. We've been able to unify that into one statewide system, which went live at the beginning of August. I'm confident in that system. When you talk about 17 systems, and some of those 17 systems were no longer being supported by the vendor, you talk about angst from a cybersecurity perspective, that's what kept me up at night. But no longer. Now that we have one of the best systems in the country, we have built additional security and rings of security around that system to ensure that no foreign actor or bad actor will be able to come after Nevada. We are in a good position, and I'm confident.
And then for Athar, I wanted to ask you, how are you preparing for Election Day, and specifically thinking about violence, protests, the need to protect free speech, but also that need to be protected when you cast a ballot and vote?
Yeah, thanks for the question. There's a couple ways we're looking at it at the ACLU of Nevada. First is the events leading up to Certification Day. So we expect some level of litigation probably that will occur. I have full faith and confidence in our Secretary of State's office. But I'll say we're used to suing the government. That's what we do. So if we see something that's off kilter in any of Nevada's counties, we'll be able to address that. We're going to have the largest election protection program that we've ever had. This will be the first time we've covered all 17 of Nevada's counties when it comes to election protection work. We have poll watchers that'll be out there. We're also going to have an attorney on Election Day in every county. And so those types of threats that we're looking at and how to address issues, including related to certification, which we view as likely to be the top litigation issue that's coming this election, not only here in Nevada, but across the country, we're prepared to deal with. We are ready to go on that, and we've been ready for that for months. Now, with respect to what happens after certification, it's actually kind of a toss-up. We expect there to be protests, regardless of the result, leading into January. You're going to see at least half the country likely upset, and we know that. And it's not just going to be here in Nevada, it'll be all across the country. We're hoping we do not have something occur that was as violent as January 6th again. But we can see and assess what some of the rhetoric looks like right now. And there's already forces that are out there on social media and other venues attempting to promulgate and push disinformation to shore up this narrative that these elections are rigged, that they're already going to be stolen, and that you need to prepare and mobilize towards violence. And that's simply not acceptable. So we'll be coordinating not only with our partners, we'll be prepared to litigate. We'll be having conversations with police departments in each of these communities. I know sometimes folks are shocked that we work with law enforcement. We in fact do on certain instances. And then when something's wrong, we also sue. So we do and we sue. It's both, right? It's not either or. But we feel confident and well prepared here in Nevada. I think if we did not have our current Secretary of State, we may have been a little bit less confident in that.
And actually, Secretary of State, I wanted to kind of follow up with, have you worked with the governor or other folks to talk about potential violence after, the election, regardless of who wins?
I'm proud of the working relationship I have with our governor. Every decision I've made as secretary, I've updated him on those decisions. I've taken his input and his guidance because it's important. He is the CEO of this state. He needs to know what's happening in the state, but also to the fact that we can work together. Yes, we are of separate parties. We are of different parties, but we are working together. One of the first things he did when he was governor was sign SB 406, which made it a felony to harass or intimidate our election workers. That was an important message to send to our 17 clerks and their teams because they knew there was 2 constitutional officers that had their back and were going to ensure that they had safe environments in which to do their job. Not only that, it's about the voters. Elections are about people. It's about the voters, it's about the candidates, and it's about the election workers and poll workers. We have to ensure their experience is one that is a positive experience.
And Sondra, I know that your organization sort of works on fair voting, access. What kind of are you thinking about sort of taking what they've said into account?
Sure, so I know there's a lot of people who really like mail-in voting. It's very convenient. You can set your ballot on the table, take your time. The thing I'm worried about, and I'm talking to students and everybody else who ask me, is making sure that you know where to look to see how your signature should look on the back of the envelope. Because that seems to be the glitch we're having in mail-in voting is the signature cure problem, where the person's signature doesn't match. And then you have to do outreach to get a hold of the voter and then have them verify that they did vote that ballot. So I'm making sure people know, look at the bottom of your driver's license or ID. That's the way your signature needs to look.
What should people do if their signature doesn't work out, or how do they monitor that? What's the best way to track it?
So the best thing to do is to sign up for ballot tracks. And so if you go to the Secretary of State's website, it's also in your sample ballot. Sign up for ballot tracks. It will tell you when they mail it to you. It'll tell you when you put it in the mail and it's arrived. And it will tell you if there's a problem and who you need to contact.
And is there anything else that sort of keeps any of the three of you up at night, or that you think about that we haven't discussed or you want to talk about now?
Yeah, look, I'll say that there's been a lot of non-serious litigation this year. I think you all have done a good job of covering each of those non-serious lawsuits that have been put forward by national conservative groups or funded by national conservative groups to attempt to create this narrative that the election system is broken, that the elections are rigged in advance. Every single one of those cases has gotten tossed. They've been dismissed, or they voluntarily pulled them. There was even an attempt to purge 30,000+ voters in the last few weeks in places like Clark and Washoe County and others. Those cases, too, were voluntarily withdrawn with our filing fees paid for intervening, because what they're attempting to do is preclude, these groups and these forces are attempting to preclude people from voting. So I'm imagining there's going to be issues there where there might be additional attempts at challenges in removing people from voter rolls. I would imagine, and I think it's very likely, I don't know what the Secretary's position is on this, but I think it's very likely that at least one county, if they're not satisfied with the results, specifically if it's not a Trump win, will seek to not certify this election and use that as a pathway to create fame for themselves and potentially get themselves a talk show or maybe even a podcast. Seems like the era. But there's a pathway there, and we've already seen what's happened in Washoe County in June. We were hoping the Supreme Court was going to decide the issue on certification there. They punted. Punting actually creates some level of uncertainty. So it's problematic. I also think Cisco had mentioned Senate Bill 406 that protects election workers. It's also key to note, and a shout out to Sigal Chadha, who did not read the brief when she actually filed a lawsuit against it, or did not read the bill, the final bill, when she filed the lawsuit against it. We wrote the section on observer protections there. So not only does it protect election workers, it also protects observers. It's very balanced.
So let me just jump in real quickly, Tabitha. You started your answer by saying non-serious lawsuits. They were non-serious in the sense that they had no merit, but they had a serious intent in mind, which was to cause problems for the Secretary of State after the election by laying the predicate down to challenge results afterwards. And so from that point of view, they were very serious, although very tendentious. Let me ask you a question, though, Mr. Secretary of State, and the two of you can weigh in on this, too, if you have any thoughts. I'm concerned about people at the polls challenging voters as they try to go and vote, it's happened occasionally in the past in my experience, but do you think there's going to be a massive effort to do that? And how are your people prepared for it?
We've met with the clerks, we've met with the DAs, we've talked with law enforcement to ensure when that situation occurs, we have a plan to address it. One, it's making sure that people understand that decorum within a polling location is sacred. There are certain behaviors that can occur and behaviors that cannot occur. If people choose not to comply with the expectations, they will be dealt with in a way immediately. And great thing about it is our communication system with the new statewide system allows a poll worker to communicate directly with the poll manager or an election center without creating additional angst for the people at the polling location. We are being very clear about what those expectations are. The Attorney General is aligned with me on these issues. The district attorneys are aligned on these issues about what we have to do to ensure to maintain decorum for every voter that's visiting that poll.
Is there going to be a law enforcement presence that may not have been there before? Because you may need law enforcement.
No, it's a great question.
Step in.
It's a great question, and it's one conversation I've had with Sheriff Balaam in Washoe County. It's what we've discussed here in Clark, is they have told me they do not want to have uniformed police presence at polling locations. What they want to do is be able to have a collaboration that when a situation arises, we can determine the best approach to that occurrence collaboratively. And that's why the Secretary of State's office has the Election Integrity Task Force, which is federal, state, and local law enforcement, and Attorney General's office, our office, and the clerk's office to work together to address these issues in real time in a central location.
And one of the advantages to having vote centers so that you can go anywhere to vote is I've actually had people say, what if I show up to vote and I don't feel safe? You can go to any other vote center. You can go to one of the malls where you're inside. If you just don't feel safe or something doesn't seem right, go to another vote center.
They could go to Allegiant Raider Stadium.
Yeah.
It's a fun place to cast a ballot.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, look, we've also discussed this. I do think that there's going to be these types of attempts. I don't know how pervasive it's going to be, but I would encourage those that are likely to be the ones that go out and attempt to challenge somebody that they don't know based on disinformation or misinformation they've received, or if it was set up in that fashion, that there remains a personal knowledge component to issuing a challenge in Nevada, right? A lot of us don't believe in this concept of these types of voter challenges, period. It's intrusive and problematic, and actually oftentimes can end up leading to harassment. We've seen that, at least with this recent batch of challenges that came through. You have somebody that's in treatment for receiving chemotherapy treatment out of state, subject to a challenge. You have somebody who's a military member's spouse serving abroad that's subject to a challenge. So we can imagine this will happen, but for those that are attempting to issue challenges without personal knowledge, we'll be following up with you. I'll just leave it at that.
And Sondra and Athar, I know both of you have traveled across the state, sort of speaking on issues from hand counting ballots to certification. What policies do you think are the most significant threat to free and fair elections?
I've mentioned the certification issue over and over because that is what the national theme looks like. The two biggest voting rights issues outside of the traditional suppression issues that we think have occurred historically are with respect to certification and mass voter challenges. I've heard that from my counterparts in places like Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and here. We connect with our other battleground affiliates to assess what those threats look like. To me, both of those issues are going to go hand in hand. I can also envision any type of scenario where there is an attempt to create a narrative that's rooted in disinformation. Someone left something in a voting booth. That means that they were tinkering with a voting machine. Now we must overturn the results of the election. And I would say that we saw that play out lightly in a couple instances, but I'd imagine that'll be on steroids this election. Now, I do think that the attempts through platforms like X and other platforms for bot machines and or interference in that way to suggest that something went wrong simply to undermine confidence in our election system is going to be the narrative that may lead into certification day, not only here in Clark County, but all throughout the state, and may end up creating some kinds of issues at that time.
Sondra, do you have anything?
So, I mean, I think I worry more about people not voting. Just saying, for whatever reason, just not voting.
Yeah.
We're probably going to leave the voter security issue in a second, but I did want to read this one question from the audience, and the secretaries, they can answer this, because I think it has to do with a misconception on one level. And this has to do with paper ballots. France hand counts paper ballots and has results in one day. Voting machines cost more money, are less trusted by voters, and introduce vulnerabilities. Having them in small numbers for the disabled or elderly makes sense, but if they're not faster, cheaper, or more secure, why does Nevada use them at all?
I'd say the great news is that actually our machines are accurate. We do test them. We do calibrate them every
They're not
election
connected
cycle.
to the internet.
They are
tell
not.
people. Okay.
The machines are not connected to
Right.
the internet. The tabulation machines are not connected to the internet. There are strong safeguards at every step of the process to ensure chain of custody, to ensure that we get the appropriate result. We are working extremely hard to build that efficiency. In 22, Clark County had 95% of the ballots on hand on Election Day. Washoe County had 97% of the ballots on hand on Election Day. What they didn't have was the capacity to process those ballots. We know this election cycle, we needed to build that capacity more than ever to ensure we get Nevadans the results they need and deserve as close to election night as possible. You know, we tested this process and this system during the Nevada primary. We had the last voter confirmed to us at 7:54. Once that last voter in Nevada was confirmed, we released results at 8:04. That gave us the ability to build trust with the voter to know these are the results so far. We did another release 2 hours later of all in person on Election Day. We are continuing to build that process. We're continuing to build that system. As Sondra said, the most important part is decreasing the number of ballots that go into curing by making sure voters update their voter registration information and they update their signature to increase the security of it, but also to increase the capacity that the clerks have to process ballots.
So you're guaranteeing here on
Not
the
guaranteeing,
stage,
look,
sir, that at
I'm saying I'm doing-
8:04 on election night, we will have all the early stuff posted.
Look, the primary in June was going to be very different than the Nevada general. We are doing everything we can with the participation of our largest clerks to ensure that we are going to do what we can to get what Nevadans want and deserve.
And John, if you're okay with that, I was thinking we can move into some ballot questions.
Sure.
All right, so we have a couple ballot questions this year that are focused on elections. And actually I wanted Sondra, if it's okay for you to start on the first one, which is ballot question 3, which would implement ranked choice and open primary voting. It's a combo, not just one or the other. And I'm curious, I've seen a lot of the write-ups of these and how it works. And the primary, you would vote for one candidate, the top 5 candidates would advance to the general. But what happens and then you would use ranked choice voting to select your candidates in the general. What happens if you have 2 candidates who are tied in that general election?
It would be the exact same rules that we use now for a tie. You draw cards.
Okay, so that wouldn't change that process.
Doesn't
Then
change.
we wouldn't.
That is one of the greatest Nevada laws of all
Yeah,
time.
we're not touching that.
That you
That's
cut
staying.
cards to see who won.
Yes.
And then I know that both parties, Democrats and Republicans, have been opposed to this measure. What has it been like going up against those two sort of very politically powerful forces?
I actually think it's been a benefit because both people will say, well, why are both parties against this? And so it brings up the conversation. And my answer is because ballot question 3 takes a little bit of power away from them in the primary and it hands it over to voters. And when you already have a lot of calculus done on how to get your candidates that the party approves of through the primary into the general, you're not going to want that messed with.
And Secretary of State, do you have any thoughts on ballot question 3? Is the office ready to implement it if it goes into effect? What do you think is vital for the voters to know?
First of all, the voters will decide. This is in their hands. They will decide if this is passed or it isn't passed. Whatever the voters pass, it is my responsibility as secretary to implement, and that's why we have started these implementation conversations in the office. As I mentioned earlier, we've been really talking about increasing that capacity to get voters results as soon as possible. One thing we noticed is after the first release of results, before we release the second results, we're going to have to ensure that every ballot is cured before we release those results. And that is a 6-day process from election day. So potentially we would not be able to release results until that 6th or 7th day. And that's what scares me a little bit, is that voters understand that this is going to change the way we operate elections from an administrative perspective. It'll change the way the ballot is laid out. It'll change out the way we do the tabulation and then the way we give results. And that is my concern. I just want to make sure, look, as secretary, it's my job to be the chief elections officer and to look at what is it we're going to have to do? What are the things we're going to have to train the clerks to understand? What are we going to have to get the staff to understand? But it's also too about voter education. We're going to have to work really hard after working so hard to build that capacity, to do what we want to do, to build that transparency, to then have to walk that back and say, well, this is how the process and the systems work. Look, Nevada has some of its unique hearing laws that aren't present in other states that have adopted this system, so we have to look through this through a Nevada lens.
You say it'll take 6 days for that to kind of fully come through. What about in races, though, where maybe there's a clear winner, there's already a majority?
But when you have several candidates, and we know how close our races are already, and those margins are even smaller, a small number of voters will have an impact on the overall race. We don't know what will happen once the last candidate is eliminated from the roll.
And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so Alaska's adopted this process. They ran it in 2022. They also have the almost exact same mail-in voting rules when it comes to counting the mail-in votes. Once they went through all the processes you have to go through with mail-in voting, so you have to wait a certain number of days and look at the postmark, then you have to do curing, then there's provisional ballots. They actually live streamed their tabulations when they did ranked choice voting. It is on YouTube. We watched it live. It's there recorded. It took them 32 minutes. And we could see right behind the registrar, she walked everybody through what was happening. We could see the ballot reallocation when there was an elimination. It took 32 minutes with their software. There was no lawsuits. There was no outcry that something bad had happened. I would hope, and I worship the ground that Mark Voloshin walks on, that we can handle doing voter education and that we can be just as transparent here.
That's not the concern, is the tabulations, it's the easy part. It's that time between votes that you have to get voters comfortable with that time. We know what happened in 2020. We know what happened in 2022 when voters had to wait to get those results.
Yeah, I believe
that's
there were a lot
where dis and misinformation happen, and that is not good for what we're trying to do when we look at our.
That's with mail-in ballots.
I guess the argument would be, okay, maybe it's going to take longer, but if the process of question 3 produced better elected officials, more moderate elected officials, then it's worth it. If that's what it does, and that's what I want to ask Sondra about. I mean, listen, people may know this, but you're also a professor. You understand history. You understand all these things. The thing that I think goes counter to the arguments for question 3, and by the way, this is the thing that people in this state have forgotten. Forget about the race for president and Senate for a second. Question 3 is going to have more impact on the future of this state than almost anything that people are voting on, considering it's going to change how we do elections. Ranked choice voting can turn losers into winners. And for someone who believes foundationally in the system that exists, you can finish in second or third place, and after this is all done. And by the way, I think that happened in Alaska in the congressional race.
It didn't.
It didn't happen.
It did not. Mary Peltola was in first place.
Was
and
she?
then
Okay.
won. She won.
Okay, maybe it's another race, but it can happen, right? You can get the most votes and lose.
Very rarely will you have someone that's in second or third place once you go through tabulations win. Rarely. And at least 90% of the time, if it's the person that's in first place, they're going to stay in first place, they're going to win. There's usually a very small number of percentage points that they're not at 50% plus 1. When you go into the tabulations, they usually will then go over the top. But very rarely do you have anybody that's bottom of the ticket, and I don't know how you're defining loser. If someone comes in 4th or 5th, rarely would you have someone like that win.
Well, loser is anyone who doesn't have the most votes. That's all I was talking.
Okay, well, you could have the second place, but here's what you have to understand about ranked choice voting. Ballot question 3 says you may rank. You may. You do not have to. You can vote exactly the way you're voting right now, pick one and be done. But if there's maybe 2 that you like or 3 that you like, you can rank those and leave the rest as none of these candidates. So it's completely an option. But what we saw in Alaska with ranked choice voting, and it made the theory play out, is Mary Peltola, who's the indigenous woman who now represents Alaska in Congress, and Lisa Murkowski, and I love her because she speaks her mind. What they did is they went out and they asked for second choice votes from their opponents' voters. They went and talked to Sarah Palin's voters. They went and talked to Patricia Chesborough's voters. Lisa Murkowski actually campaigned with the Democrat and said, hey, you know what? It's going to be a Republican who wins. Let me make the case that I can be the Republican who can represent you, Democrats. And because of that, she got almost 21,000 second choice votes from Democrats. But right now, when Donald Trump tells her how to jump, she says, absolutely not. You're not my constituent. That's what I want here.
And you're talking about implementation, right, within the office. What do you think is one of the biggest challenges to implementation for your staff?
I think it's voter education. Again, it's explaining to voters how the process works, what is required from a time perspective, and then making sure we get it done right. I'm confident they'll get it done right if that's what Nevada voters choose. It's just, again, going back out there and figuring out how do we educate voters after the changes and the implementations we've had since 2021.
And do those voter education efforts include different languages, or what specifically is hard about explaining this to voters?
I think it's something new to them, and anytime there's something new, it's getting them to understand it before it actually works. I think a lot of people wait to the very last minute because they're busy with their lives, they're busy doing what they do, and then when it comes up and they actually see it work, is making sure they understand, because we do not want somebody to have a misinterpretation. And the way Sondra explains it is super helpful to a voter, but how do we get a Sondra in front of every single Nevadan to explain this process?
It's not that hard. It's called Zoom.
Is the ACLU agnostic on this?
We are.
Wait a minute.
We're not.
Zoom, we have disinformation now. Zoom doesn't solve the problems we have now available. It takes engagement with communities in an authentic way where they trust you. A Zoom is not building trust and authenticity about how a system works.
Then I'll be in front of every single person in the state of Nevada if that's what it takes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Believe me, she has the energy to do it. Go ahead, Athar.
Yeah, I was going to say we are agnostic on this one. It's a rarity that we're agnostic on issues. I think
Yes.
take an issue on or take a position on most issues. Part of the reason why we're agnostic is I think both sides have really laid out their positions well. The way that we view this is there a civil liberties or civil rights issue? Now, both sides that are advocates for and against are going to say yes. On our end, we don't think so. We think that it's a different way of doing things. If you look at the proponents and the opponents of it, it has formed very odd coalitions, in my opinion. I have heard from proponents that are nonpartisan voters. They want to be able to participate in the primaries. I've heard from opponents of this that say you can just register with the party and then vote in the race you want to. On the ranked choice voting side, I've heard folks that think it's beneficial because of the results in Alaska. I've heard folks that have opposed it because of the results in New York or other places where they haven't liked it as much. I will tell you the one thing that stands out to me as unfortunately somebody who has had to watch a hand counting process unfold over and over is the tabulation portion as was mentioned. I think that to the point about education that Sondra and Cisco had both mentioned, there remain gaps in understanding what that looks like. I will say, as an independent observer outside of being a proponent or opponent of the campaigns, there was a heavy focus on the open primary piece, I think, by the proponents. I don't know that ranked choice, the messaging on how it actually plays out, came into play, but I also recognize, too, it's not a system that's totally unfamiliar to many of us. During the Democratic primary in 2022, if you submitted a paper mail-in, not really a mail-in ballot, I'd say a sort of a paper submission at that point, you did a ranked choice process at that time, so it's not unheard of. But it is new to Nevada voters, right? And so I think however it plays out, we'll be prepared still either way to defend against challenges that might end up ensuing as a result of
Let me ask a quick question, Sondra, on this, because you're willing to take heat from either side. You have for a long time. You're always straightforward in putting forth what you think is best. I think open primaries are a bad idea, but forget about that for a second. I think Democrats should be able to nominate Democrats and Republicans without interference. You can do same-day registration. Forget about that for a second. It is clear, and I don't think you're doing the ads, but it is clear that the people don't think they can sell ranked choice voting. They think that people won't understand it. It'll be confusing. Open primaries in a state where you've had this explosion of nonpartisan voters, and some of these ads are incredibly disingenuous. Veterans can't vote. These people who sacrificed for our country. I mean, it's nonsense. Does that bother you at all?
Okay, so let's talk about the plague of consultants. Anytime you work on a ballot question, it's going to cost money in the state because the Democrats are always going to sue me. But it costs a lot of money to get signatures. It costs a lot of money. You're going to have to gather up money from people who think that they know better than everybody else. And they're going to hire consultants who think that they understand on messaging. So right now, the consultants that are working officially on Yes on 3 are making the decisions on digital advertising. You will notice there's the mailers that are coming are starting to include ranked choice voting, and that's because me and the grassroots team have been screaming bloody murder at them. That is why, if you know anything about me, you're probably thinking, I wish you would just shut up about ranked choice voting, because I've been talking about it for 3 years. I have been going to every meeting, every Zoom, every place I can go, talking on the phone. If you have questions, I will be there for you. I'm an educator. If people want to understand ranked choice voting, I will help you. If you don't feel comfortable with it, I would not force you. But we're going to have to maybe have a discussion in the state about how we do ballot questions to kick the consultants out.
I don't think that would be constitutional, but
If we put it in the Nevada Constitution, it could be. Maybe that's the next ballot question I work on.
what I think is funny in quotes, is that people say, oh, this is so hopelessly complicated, voters won't understand it. It's actually pretty simple. I mean, Tabitha explained it in the 10 seconds when she asked her first question, but I don't think people like change in general, and it only passed, what, by 3 points or so, 6 points? Yeah, last time, and there was no opposition essentially last time, right? And so it's going to be close, and I think it will have a huge change in how we conduct elections and the kinds of people we elect.
But do you know how many times we've changed our elections since 2000? We were using the punch card. Do you remember that Florida had in 2000? We've adopted machines, we've adopted poll books, we've adopted vote centers. I know because I've helped on voter education for every time we've added in something new since 2001.
Well, and actually, John, I wanted to follow up with a question to you on this. As somebody
Wait a second, I'm not here to answer.
Good. All right, good.
Sorry, surprise. As someone who predicts elections, or the outcomes of elections, will this change how you predict or think or process those numbers or data?
I would like to, right at IndyFest, announce my retirement from predicting elections. Listen, it'd be hard enough to predict without it this time. You know, it's interesting what Sondra makes, because the points that she made earlier, it almost argues against it in the sense that she said that it almost rarely changes who wins. If the first place person is there, they're probably going to be first place after all of it said and done. So maybe you don't need it, but I don't think it's always going to work that way. It doesn't. People should know, by the way, it doesn't apply to local elections, doesn't apply to the presidential race, but in some legislative races, I think it could make a really big difference.
But okay, so you were just, and let me make something clear. Cisco and I are friends. We're just having an argument about, and I highly respect.
It's not an argument, I'm just trying to.
No, we're just kind of making sure everything's going
He's
to work
just
out.
pretending not to be against it when we know he is.
Okay, so we were just talking about making sure we get results from mail-in ballots out sooner. So on election night, we might have someone that's in the lead, and then 3 days later, it might be someone else that wins, right? So the issue you're bringing up actually also applies to mail-in voting.
I wouldn't say that's apples to apples, but I think it is a faith in elections issue that is a serious one, and maybe the deadlines for mail ballots should be changed. But I agree it's a real issue. No more questions for me. Ask them something.
Well, actually, if you're all right with it, I was thinking we could move into another ballot question, which is question 7, which is on voter ID and implementation of voter ID. I'd like to start with Secretary of State. Sorry to put you on the hot seat there. But is your office ready to implement this? What do voters need to know about this?
We're ready to go. Whatever the will of the voter is what we're going to do. That's my job. You know, but can I step out of talking about the ballot issue and just talk about voter registration as a whole?
Absolutely.
I think it's important for people to understand, because I think this answers a lot of other questions. The way voter registration works is a Nevadan who is eligible to vote has to prove identity and has to prove eligibility through very specific identification processes. Those processes are strong. We do not have widespread fraud in Nevada. So if you're trying to solve those issues with this issue, I think it's important to understand how the process actually works.
And Athar, I was wondering, from the ACLU's perspective, do they take a stance on this ballot?
Oh yeah, we're definitely not agnostic on this one. We're absolutely opposed to voter ID, and I'm going to share a couple of reasons why. This is a solution in search of a problem. There is no problem with respect to this issue. Any time that this issue has been brought to the forefront historically, it's been used in a suppressive fashion. The historical legacy of voter ID is rooted in effectively Jim Crow era policy to suppress the rights of communities of colors or those that have historically been disenfranchised to be able to vote. We've talked about the concept of this being a potential poll tax. Not everybody has easy access to an ID, something that's come up. The court actually punted on the substantive portion of whether or not, in fact, it is a poll tax. So we think that there's barriers there. But you look at the people who are most likely to not be able to get an ID. Who does that end up being? Folks who might have a disability that can't have easy access to the DMV. People who are unhoused that don't necessarily have the resources to get over there. We think about people who are young, 18 years old, they're on their own for the first time. They don't have much money, they don't have much time, they're getting their first job. Not the top priority, they should still be able to vote. There's an expansive period, as Cisco mentioned in advance, to be able to register in that way. But then you think about potential misapplication and how this is viewed at actual polling sites. And this isn't to denigrate an election worker, period. But we have a lot of temporary employees that end up staffing these voting locations. You show up to an ID, and let's say you see somebody who may have transitioned recently, and their ID doesn't necessarily match what's showing. Now you have somebody who's been trained for a week maybe, telling them that they're not able to vote. So the odds are that this will go worse than better. But the other thing that I always share with folks is that, in the law, whenever we're looking at something, there's a problem that we have already identified. I am yet to meet anyone who is able to quickly and readily identify the name of one person in Nevada that has committed voter impersonation. Not one. No name, no case. That's how we view it. But beyond that, we start to look at what the system would do. And it would, in fact, create opportunities to continue to modify our state's constitution based on disinformation. How many artificial, manufactured problems will we end up creating where we thereafter open up the Constitution and subject it to a change because there are people and forces that want to continue to undermine faith in our election system? So that is the basis for why we're opposed. I'm sure someone will present an argument to me at some point where this makes sense and actually identifies the pervasiveness of the problem that's rooted in fact with citation. But that's still not happened. And so we think making policy, especially permanent policy and modifying the Constitution based on misinformation is problematic.
So I'm a certified field registrar, so I am trained by the Elections Department to do voter registration. And exactly what Cisco said is true. When we do voter registration, we need to see an ID, we need last of your Social Security, we send it into the office, they verify. You go through the whole process at the front end so that you don't have to do a process at the back end.
And I guess we've seen, though, that from polling, this is an incredibly popular issue here in Nevada among voters, right? Huge support for voter ID. Do you think that voters just maybe don't understand, or do you think voters are saying, hey, this could be a safety and security and just another way to add another layer to it?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think to Sondra's point about consultants, there has been money spent, and that's generally how these campaigns end up being effective. You have to spend money in order to get these questions passed. There's a reason why people invest in these types of questions. I'll say the proponents of the question have used this as their voter turnout tool, and they're hoping that creating distrust in our election system and pushing this artificial solution of voter ID is a means of pushing people to turn out to vote. The impact of doing so would be problematic. But that's part of the reason why we end up saying that, the actual narrative surrounding it are rooted in a lack of understanding. There's only so much money and airtime to go around to be able to cover these issues. I think the proponents of this in the signature gathering process demonstrated the commitment they have to using this as a turnout tool, spending significant sums to be able to reach a signature threshold, and then investing in the question afterwards to push this forward. But from our vantage point, that becomes, again, a dangerous tactic. And we'll see how voters end up deciding, not just this coming election, but also when it goes, if it should pass, going back to the ballot in 2026. And
let me make my easiest prediction of this year. It's going to pass, and it's going to pass overwhelmingly because of the campaign that's been run. Who funded the signature gathering? Who's funding this? Do you know? I'll tell you who's funding it, the governor. And the governor raised all the money for it. And it's sad that it's become such a hyper-partisan issue because that's bad for the system. But let me...
Can I say something about it, too? It's the only thing I'm going to say is voting is a fundamental constitutional right. Comparing to buying a beer with an ID, buying a beer is not a constitutional fundamental right. Voting is. And we need to understand how serious that is.
Don't worry, I wasn't going to ask you that question. But I do think that there is a serious issue here in the sense that, as Athar pointed out, this is, whether it's intentional or not, going to cause more distrust in the election process. That, in other words, it's not working now. We need to have voter ID to fix it. Of course, there is no evidence whatsoever that people are going in person. Or the notion of widespread fraud that has been put forth by some. Does anybody realize the kind of numbers that would have to be in the conspiracy to actually carry out what? That's nonsense. However, One thing that's been said that I think is interesting, and you can answer this, Cisco, that you guys wouldn't know. You don't have the staff, that the AG's office doesn't have the staff to investigate if this stuff. I'm not talking about a box full of nonsense that Michael McDonald carries up to your office. I'm talking about that you wouldn't know is the argument because you don't have the staff to police it. You think that's true?
I think it is true, and we're learning more and more. You know, last legislative session, we were giving funding for 2 civil investigators, 1 criminal investigator, and we're working through those processes. It's better than what we had before in the Secretary of State's office. It's an opportunity to respond to every election integrity violation report that we receive for citizens to know that, hey, we are listening to you, we are looking at things, we are looking at the data. If there are a certain number of reports that occur, we start to do deep investigations into those issues. It's also working with local law enforcement. It is working with the local district attorney to make sure we are addressing these issues in real time. But again, it's yes, could we use more? Absolutely. I think, you know, the federal government has deemed elections critical infrastructure, but haven't given the funding to match what the federal government deems a critical infrastructure. This country is going to spend about $5 billion this year on elections. Even more in battleground states because we're having to do things that red or blue states don't have to do because we know our foreign adversaries are watching what we're doing here in Nevada. But thankfully, our legislature and our governor gave us the investment to be able to do what we needed to do to protect Nevadans.
And look, thinking about this mail-in ballot voting, right, system, the constitutional amendment that's going forward actually addresses mail-in ballots with this question. We were talking about it in the back, actually. Would this actually make it so that mail-in ballots are protected in the Constitution? Because it's included as part of this ballot measure?
I'll send it to the real lawyer.
Look, I'll jump in on that one. I can't recall any scenario where there was consideration under state law where our state constitution was modified to include specific provisions that allow for a specific activity, and thereafter the legislature is simply able to go in as a matter of statute and remove that right. So there could be a scenario that I can envision that we're exploring right now where the question for those who are actually advocating for it could do 2 things. It could end up creating, and again, we're not sure on this yet, right? Some of this is going to end up being explored over the long haul, which is why I'm not a big fan of opening up the Constitution for unexplored, untampered with questions. This is permanency that's associated with it. But for those that are proponents of it, there's 2 things to consider. One, the actual poll tax related question that hasn't been answered could end up coming back disfavorably to advocates, and that could end up being struck down. And 2, there could be the reality that sets in that they've created this mail-in qualifier within this ballot question that's now been added to the Constitution, and then it gets put in. So for proponents of the question, they should grapple with the question of, are you comfortable with the level of certainty where, in fact, once the ACLU sues on this, because it's likely, I'll say I'm not guaranteeing it, but I'd imagine that's the crystal ball would say it's likely, you could end up with a scenario where you don't have in-person voter ID, and now you have permanency with respect to mail-in voting.
So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I started by asking Cisco this question. He didn't really answer it, and I'm going to give him another chance in a second. But I want to start with Sondra on this one. You've experienced a lot of elections in Nevada. What keeps you up at night?
People not voting. We had 19% turnout in our primary in June. That worries me because that means the people who did vote have an outsized influence on what's going to happen in the general election. We have a lot of young people, we have a lot of new residents, people who are just not voting. We need to get them into the system, and we need to hear their voices.
Athar, what about you?
Probably misinformation and disinformation surrounding basic tasks, including our elections not being secure, and then that fueling potential not only violent rhetoric, but violent actions that far exceed the bounds of the First Amendment. I view myself as one of the strongest proponents of being anti-censorship, but the bounds of the First Amendment are not well understood amongst advocates of violence and or other theatrics that end up exceeding the First Amendment bounds, and I don't want to see a repeat of a January 6th scenario again.
Cisco, I wonder if you worry about what's going to happen in some of these rural counties. And I saw the other day, and I can't believe this is real, that they're doing tomorrow in Carson City a Trump rally, a Trump fight rally that is being headlined by the Carson City Clerk Recorder. That is insane. Is it not?
I believe it's the responsibility of a clerk and a secretary of state to understand their responsibilities as the chief elections officers in their communities, and that your responsibility is to ensure trust among all Nevada voters that you are doing the job that's in the best interest of those individuals.
Oh my God, you are good. You are running for governor, aren't you? But seriously, are you worried about what's going to happen there? You feel you have the systems in place?
We do. You know, the sheriff in Carson City also understands his obligation and his responsibility to all voters in that city and that community. Being there and spending the significant amount of time that I have, and you know, last week we wrapped up our tour of all 17 counties. We went into Lincoln County, went into White Pine and Eureka, and talking about what it truly means to be in some of those communities and the pride that these clerks have to do their job.
Yeah.
They understand it is their responsibility to build that trust. Look, all I can say is Mo Dang and Pesto want you to vote. Please vote.
All right, we're going to take a break after this panel for about an hour and a half, so you don't have to rush back from lunch. We'll have Sam Brown here for an interview with Gabby Birnbaum and myself. Tabitha, thanks for asking all these great questions, and thanks to all of you. You're all busy people, especially this time of year. Thanks for coming. Let's give them a round of applause.